Hello. Writing feminist genealogies, namely problematizing women's present, unsettling its histories, and reimagining its future, has been at the heart of all my research projects since the days of my PhD. As a Foucauldian approach, genealogy interrogates established truths and knowledges about our present, and by turning into the past, it unveils their historical and contingent constitution as material and discursive archives of understanding. In the wider context of my research, a question that I often respond to when I present my work on different occasions and with different audiences is, so, what have you identified as a critical issue in your feminist genealogies? And the answer for some years now has been, well, it seems that women have messed their lives in matters of love, whatever their social, cultural, political, or even sex or gender position within the histories and geographies of modernity. Indeed, love has become a recurring theme in my research, whether I have been writing about women erasing their sexuality in their attempt to become teachers, facing the dilemma of whether to paint or to love in the process of being recognized as artists, surviving the labor union's hierarchy in their struggles as workers, or even fleeing the heteropatriarchal assemblages as forcefully displaced subjects. But it seems that love has been a thorny issue, not just in women's lives. It has also become a contested field within feminism, where the thesis against love has been the dominant discourse for years. Feminist attacks against the myth of romantic love and its disastrous effects upon women's lives go back to the Enlightenment philosophies of modernity. Mary Wollstonecraft was unequivocal in her vindication of the rights of woman. And I quote here, "Love was declared to be a stalking mischief, not merely transitory, capricious, and unreliable at the individual level, but also a sign of moral weakness and a harbinger of vast and unspeakable social disorder," as Susan Mandus has commented. In the line of Wollstonecraft's thesis against love, the recurrent theme of second-wave feminist discourse on love was to conceive heterosexual love as a delusion or false consciousness, ensuring that women continued to submit to men. Lena Gunnarsson, Adriana Garcia Andrade, and Anna Jonasdottir have noted in introducing their edited collection on feminism and the power of love. I was part of this tradition, and in my previous genealogical work, I have drawn on Foucauldian vocabularies to configure love as a disciplinary technology, constituting women as docile subjects within patriarchal regimes of power and domination. But alongside my Foucauldian approach to love as a disciplinary dispositif, I have also traced forces of love within assemblages of power and desire, drawing on Deleuze and Guattari's analysis. Such an approach has brought forward philosophical approaches to love that go back to Sappho's poetry and her materialist conceptualization of eros as juxtaposed to its ethereal configuration in the founding text on love, Plato's Symposium. What I want to highlight here is the emergence of a rich body of literature on feminist love studies that depart from the previous negative approaches, highlight the creative dynamism of love, and situate it as a question for feminism in the 21st century. This latest body of literature also draws on Black feminist studies, wherein love has been importantly theorized as a source of power in Black women's lives. My own explorations in the thorny paths of love have always followed narrative tracks and traces, and within this horizon, it is no wonder that I was drawn to Hannah Arendt's take on love, which contributes to the current burgeoning body of feminist love studies. In charting this field, Margaret Toy has highlighted the fact that Arendt's work is becoming increasingly important in rethinking love. Julia Kristeva's engagement with Arendt's work on narratives and love has been an early dialogic encounter in this emerging field. More recently, Lisbeth Schoenheim has discussed Arendt's conception of romantic love in relation to Simone de Beauvoir's take on love in The Second Sex, arguing that both theories share a relational conception of the self. My research and a book which is about to be published is situated in this field. Drawing on my research for this book, in this talk I have developed the notion of the assemblage of love in Arendt's work by bringing together insights from her political and philosophical writings, her letters, and her entries in her philosophical diary. What I further propose is that thinking with Spinoza and Arendt opens up new vistas in understanding love and grounding it on a plane of new materialist thought. Since my research draws on letters and correspondences, I also look at the question of what it means to analyze love letters, what we can possibly derive from them, and how we can both identify and work with their constraints and limitations. The language of love is impossible, inadequate, immediately elusive when one would like it to be more straightforward. It is a flight of metaphors. It is literature. Julia Kristeva has influentially written. Even when we find a way to express amorous feelings, do we speak of the same thing when we speak of love? She has pertinently asked. Indeed, the language of love is an agonistic practice which puts the university of language and its referential and communicative power to the test. Moreover, there is an unbridgeable gap between speaking love and living it, Kristeva has further noted, raising the question of the embodied experience of love. In looking into feminist discourses around love, Margaret Toy has drawn on Kristeva and Irigaray, amongst others, to underline the crucial role of language in mediating affects, particularly highlighting how love should not only be taken as a dyadic relation between the self and the other, but also as a transformative process of the self. Toy highlights the importance of the distance or spacing between the self and the other. This spacing interrogates the status of the subject, but also creates a place for two subjects to exist, she argues. In this context, she introduces the notion of a poetics of love as an assemblage of ethical, aesthetic, and political modalities of thinking around love. In dealing with love's resistance to representation and communicability, and following Kristeva and Toy, I have deployed the notion of epistolary poetics as a configuration of the way I have brought together Arendian theoretical narratives in dialogue with a selection of her feminist interlocutors, Adriana Cavarero and Bonnie Honig, but also with the epistolary and political writings of four revolutionary women: the French Désirée Verreguet, the Polish Rosa Luxemburg, and the Russian émigrés to the US, Emma Goldman and Rose Pessotta. Despite their differences in terms of their political ideas and positions, but also in terms of the social, cultural, and economic conditions that underpin their lived experiences, all four women grappled not only with the existential aporias of love, but also with the discourses and practices of free love. But given the time limitations of this talk, as well as the focus of the whole conference on the Anglophone world, I will only offer insights from my work with the letters of two anarchist women, the Red Emma Goldman and the labor organizer Rose Pessotta. Although they were both Russian Jewish émigrés in the US, they wrote in English, their second language. We think in generalities, but we live in detail. Alfred North Whitehead has famously noted, importantly adding that to make the past live, we must perceive it in detail in addition to generalities. It is precisely the perception and understanding of the detail, as well as the wholeness of the writer-actor, that letters generously offer in autobiographical research, ultimately the gift of thinking poetically, as Arendt has put it. But in order to receive and appreciate this gift, we need to tend to the reading and analysis of letters with sensibility, patience, and attentive care, particularly recognizing the need to see them as pearls, corals, and crystallizations of thought, in Arendt's words, but also as carriers of signs of love in their entanglement with politics. In my work, I have followed this analytical path in reading, interpreting, and in effect rewriting women's letters, throwing myself in the adventures of epistolarity in autobiographical research. By bringing together epistolary stories, my intention has been to create archives for historical and sociological understanding. The turn of the 19th century was a period when discourses around love and sexuality became a theme of concern in the international socialist circles in general, and the labor movement in particular. It was during this time that the idea of free love, which had emerged in the theoretical writings of the European utopian socialist movements of the 19th century, also became an anarchist principle. Despite its roots in the founding texts of socialism, radical sexual politics remained in the margins of the labor movement, and it was only taken up as an important political issue within a small circle of its feminist and anarchist circles, both in Europe and the US. Moreover, questions around gender relations have also divided the revolutionary movements in modernity, whether utopian, socialist, or anarchist. Jessup Baton has identified two trends: the political radicals, who thought that the woman's question would be solved after the revolution, and the cultural radicals who kept insisting that the woman's question went hand in hand with the sex question, and that the destruction of capitalism would not necessarily mean the subversion of bourgeois values vis-à-vis women's rights and sexual freedom. As a matter of fact, cultural radicals thought that the economic and social transformation of society would only occur when the emotional and sexual lives of men and women had been transformed. Free love was thus a contested side, but my research has also shown that women political activists positioned themselves differently in it. In looking into the ways revolutionary women wrote about love, either in their personal correspondence or in their political texts, differences were also traced between theory and praxis. Put simply, the way women thought and wrote about love and the way they lived and experienced amorous relationships. Agonism was at the heart of such complex and often contradictory feelings, affects, and relations. Agonism points toward a practice of theoretical politicization of what we may have understood as private, non-political, or irrelevant to the public realm, Lida Maxwell has argued. It is precisely in this liminal space between the private and the public, politics and pastios, as well as the gap between words and deeds, that the Arendtian theorization of love has unfolded in my research, in conversation with the amorous epistolaria and political writings of 4 revolutionary women. There were different ways that agonism was enacted in revolutionary women's entanglements in the poetics of love. Emma Goldman's love life was immersed in her radical anarchist politics. Her agon was not only staged against the heteronormative values of the bourgeois society, but against her own people, her anarchist comrades. This was a difficult agon indeed, particularly given the contradictions between her theoretical celebration of free and unrestricted love and the lived experiences of dealing with the pragmatics of it, particularly so because she did not actually practice free love in the decade of her relationship with Ben Reitman. Later in life and while in exile, Emma Goldman felt the loneliness of not being loved and wrote about it in her letters to Alexander Bergman. Her letters and political writings about and around love thus emerge as the discursive effect of the agonistic process of what I want to configure as her ideal materialism, an embedded and embodied rebellion underpinned by the social, economic, and cultural conditions of her position as a transnational working-class intellectual on the one hand, and idealistic attachments to the purity of truth and the beauty of ideas on the other. While Emma Goldman was a renowned anarchist from the early days of her political agonism, things were very different for the anarchist labor organizer Rose Pessoa. As the only woman in the hierarchy of the International Ladies' Garment Workers' Union, Rose Pessoa's position was lonely, precarious, and in the end, untenable. Rose was amongst those anarchists who thought that sexuality was a private matter and certainly not a priority for the labor movement. Although her amorous relationships were unconventional and outside the institutional restrictions of marriage, she did not find happiness in love. Her uneasiness and anxiety vis-à-vis her position as the other woman is diffused in her amorous correspondence and vividly stages her agonism towards the impasses of free love. Despite their differences, the two women were related to anarchism and also had connections with the labor movement. However, while for Emma Goldman the sexual question was a political question, sexual freedom was bracketed in Rose Pessota's labor activism. Here they followed the historical divide between the political and cultural radicals that Baton has discussed, as we have already mentioned. What is also important to consider in these two cases is the wider socio-political and cultural context within which they experimented with and wrote about love. Emma Goldman's ideas and activism should be considered within the Greenwich Village feminism in New York between 1910 and 1920. While adopting the socialist dream of changing the world, the village feminists argued that women should develop their human potentials by smashing the social barriers that encage them within restrictive roles, and they wanted to experiment with their sexual lives, roles, and identities. They exchanged their ideas through discussion and reading clubs, a theater group, and their famous journal, The Masses. The new women of the Greenwich Bohemians were bold in expressing their sexual desires, and their revolt was both against capitalism and against Puritanism. However, when the Red Scare overshadowed American politics, feminism and free love were associated with the communist threat, and this led to the decline of Bohemian ideas in the 1920s, around the same time that Emma Goldman was deported. It was in the cold climate of the Red Scare that Rose Pessotta became of age, both as a trade unionist and a woman in love. Analyzing positions on sexuality taken by labor organizations in the past, Peter Drucker points to the importance of recognizing the heterogeneity of the labor movement in terms of gender, generational, and social differences, particularly when considering that the background of its leaders and intellectuals was rarely in the working class itself. Rose Pessotta's relationship with Powers Hapgood should be seen through Drucker's lens of difference within the labor movement. He was a Harvard graduate from a well-established family in the American left, and she was a migrant woman worker who learned English in a night school and got her qualifications in the educational institutions of the labor movement. Their gender, social, economic, and cultural differences had an impact on how they approached their sexual lives and commitments within an overall puritanical climate that followed the Russian Revolution. Differences notwithstanding, free love for both revolutionary women meant not marrying, or rather entering into marrying contracts for the purpose of legalizing their alien status and facilitating their mobility. The critique of marriage was at the heart of all utopian feminist and revolutionary movements from different angles and perspectives. Marriage was castigated as the foundation of both capitalism and patriarchy, as well as the institution that crushed and destroyed love. By opposing marriage, both women also declared and indeed demanded their right to happiness. But unlike their male comrades, happiness was not linked to sexual pleasure. It was rather the Arendian quest for happiness that we can trace in their amorous correspondence. Italian political theorist Olivia Guaraldo has considered entanglements between action, freedom, and happiness, arguing that Arendt's neglected notion of public happiness can help us reimagine the political as a plane of affective realignments. It is from the relational scene of being and acting together that public happiness surges in Guaraldo's analysis as the intersubjective experience connected to the exercise of public freedom. What I want to suggest here is that this collective happiness further generates a wider ambience of Spinoza's joy, wherein bodies' power to affect and be affective is also increased. It is thus the two women's immersion in the collective sphere of action that has generated the happiness underpinning the amorous passions and feelings that they have expressed in their correspondence. Being comrades and lovers was a subject position that both of them inhabited, no matter how fleeting and transient this experience was. Feeling love was not just an experience of joy and happiness, both personal and collective, but also the political force that drove their actions and winged their pens. They loved while acting, and they acted for love. What I finally suggest is that revolutionary women's epistolary narratives create an archive of existential experiences that act as counter memories of who they are, how they act, and what they can become. In this light, their letters contribute to an ongoing process of intense memory work around the importance of emotions in general and love in particular in the histories of modernity. Thank you.